Number 15. My friend and I were going to a party a few hours out of town, so we decided to stay at her family's holiday house about an hour south of the party. We arrived around mid-afternoon, and it was winter in a holiday town, so the area was completely empty, no other cars on the street. When we left for the party, I spent a moment deciding whether to pull the gate all the way closed. I had some trouble opening it when we arrived, and if we were getting home late at night, I didn't want to be stuck outside. I decided to shut it for security. Party was great. We got back to the house around 12:30 and the gate was open. I immediately felt on edge because not only did I know I'd locked it, but I knew it couldn't just blow open in the wind. But I didn't want to make a big deal, so I was vague when my friend asked if I shut it. We went inside and decided to make a snack. I was wandering through the house when suddenly my friend raced from the kitchen into the hallway and virtually tackled me to the ground. She was convinced she heard someone walking around outside. We tried to calm ourselves down, but we had no cell reception and there was no one else around. Over the next half an hour or so, we sat in the hallway paralyzed with fear. We heard footsteps outside and the back door being jimmied. We decided we had to leave, so we gathered everything and got ready to make a break for the car. Just as we were at the front door ready to leave, there was a huge bang in the backyard, and suddenly what sounded like hundreds of birds started screaming. We legged it to the car, ended up starting it with all of our stuff still on our laps. We hadn't even bothered to put it in the back seat. As we reversed out of the driveway, we saw someone running up the side of the house towards us. Sped the entire way home, and even once we got back to my place, didn't sleep at all that night. Number 14. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on some land my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and covered in woods. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king and there was nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. It was also the type of town, along with it being the early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry about too much about locking their doors or setting an alarm. Now our trailer was a 2-bedroom and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it, and my sister's was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night after everyone had gone to bed, my dad was woken up by the feeling that there was someone in the room. He looked around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just feet from my bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch next to his bed and saw it was a neighbor from down the road named Carter. Carter was known to be a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of this. My dad asked him what the fuck he was doing here and told him to get out of the house. He responded, "I can't get out. The demons are chasing me and your house is the only safe one." My dad, who I should say is a fairly large and terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out and get out quickly, that the house would be a lot less safe for him. "If I leave, they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night. If they catch me, I'm dead." My dad's response was there was no demons, but that if he didn't get the fuck out of the house, he'd be dead. From what I've been told since I was asleep for this part, my mom also hurled a few threats, and while she may not be big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the door and watched through the blinds as Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old beater Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for about an hour. We called the police and it took him about that long to get to us since the closest police station was about 20 or 30 minutes away. He finally brought it back and was arrested and taken to jail. He was deemed crazy and ended up locked in a mental institution. The scarier part is, for years after this, we'd get phone calls where all we'd hear is music lyrics that would always have lyrics like, "I'm going to fucking kill you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we had always had different numbers and would even be in different states. We always thought it was him sending us a message. The calls stopped when I was about 12. I later found out it was around that time that Carter thought the best thing he could do for himself was soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire. Number 13. When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. We'd chill out and I vividly remember him telling me stories, although I have absolutely no recollection about what they actually were. I remember one day talking to my parents about it. Dad traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into, and I started telling him about my dresser buddy. He wanted to know his name. It was something innocent like Peter or Patrick, but I can still see him going white in the face. I drew Peter or Patrick out for him, and the very next day, him and my uncle took that dresser and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later that I found out my dad's little brother, my uncle, also had the same friend with the same name who lived in the same antique dresser. After a few months of typical imaginary friend shit, my uncle started having night terrors and couldn't sleep because of Peter or Patrick. It got so bad they had to move him out of his room before he managed to get back to normal. Number 12. I was visiting family for winter break in Los Angeles. This was about 5 years ago. I was heading to the bathroom on the second floor of my aunt's house when I saw my cousin April on the stairs. April was 4 and very animated. She was busy making funny faces while sitting on the stairs. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." I looked around. There was no one else but us. I asked, "Where is the lady, April?" She pointed to a beam running parallel to the stairwell. I asked April, "What is the lady doing?" She said, "Making funny faces." I smiled and started walking up the stairs again when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Her braids is around her neck." I turned back and asked April to repeat herself. April pointed, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." Then April started making a face when I realized it was someone gasping for air. Number 11. I once worked on an Indian reservation, and it's late at night in South Dakota. Some friends and I are driving. One of them is native, and we are discussing folktales of the area. Suddenly, I see a white light running towards the road across the plains, and my friend steps on the brakes. "You're doing that because you saw it too, right?" "Yup." We pull up to the area, and there is nothing there. I have goosebumps all the way back to where I'm staying. That night, I have awful dreams about native warriors trying to destroy New York City, and then I wake up with something breathing in my ear, whispering to me. I scream my friend's name, and he looks over at me and tells me it's okay. I fall back into the same dream over and over again. I keep trying to change the outcome. The next day, my friend told me when he woke up and saw me screaming, a massive shadow was above me. The tall man. Not Slenderman. This guy is different. My friend didn't want to tell me he saw it because he knew it would freak me out even more. Was afraid to sleep for weeks. Smudged the crap out of my room, put sage on the window still, and hung up mad dream catchers. Shit was scary but also kind of funny. I think they had fun messing with the white girl. Number 10. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it a year or so ago. We'll call her Minji. Minji is in her late 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy. They were up studying pretty late and the buses stopped running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus the next morning. Minji was very reluctant because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he was begging her and eventually she got relented. They went back to her one-room apartment and she got into the bed while he laid a blanket out on the floor and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m., the boy wakes Minji up. "I'm really hungry," he says. "Let's go get some food." Minji opens her eyes and looks up at him in disbelief. "Food? Now? It's 2 a.m., go back to bed." But the student insists. "No, I'm so hungry. Let's eat something now." She tells him that there's some ramen in the kitchen and he can fix himself some. This doesn't satisfy him. He doesn't want ramen. There's a 24-hour place just down the road. Let's go there. Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy gets Minji to come with him to the restaurant. They leave the apartment and head out, and as soon as they're on the street, the boy turns to Minji and says, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They call the police and discover that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on her floor, so had a clear view under the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues, but that's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to anyone I know. Number 9. When I was a child, we would frequently get calls for a woman named Tanya. Didn't seem like a big deal. She had the same last name as us, although it's quite a common one around here. When we moved across the city and phone books stopped being the go-to for finding someone's number, the calls for Tanya gradually stopped. Those days seemed to have ended and we carried on forgetting about the mysterious Tanya. It was about 4 years ago that she popped up in our lives again. I was driving home from work one afternoon and was greeted by a pretty grisly car wreck that turned to my house. 2 cars had collided and one had wrapped itself around the signage pole that had house numbers and directions on it, one of which was my house number. Several days later we get a call from the police. They asked if Tanya was at this residence. Her car was found wrapped around a pole down the street from my house and she was nowhere to be found at the accident site. Haven't heard anything about her since. Number 8. My mom had 3 kids. There's me, the youngest, and my older brother. But before either of us were born, there was Jonathan. He was a sweet little boy, big blue eyes, known for accidentally repeating dad's swears in church. Wholesome kid, great in school, active outside. When he was almost 6, he was riding his bike and fell and hit his head on a rock. He got up and said he felt fine. My mom found him the next morning in his bed when she tried to wake him up to get to kindergarten. One pupil dilated and the other not. She got him airlifted to the nearest hospital. During this time, Jonathan's best friend Nick was sitting at the breakfast table eating cereal. Nick suddenly gets up from the table and goes to the door. When his mom asks him what's up, Nick says Johnny was calling for him. You see, Nick and Johnny lived on separate blocks, but they weren't allowed to cross the street without a parent yet because they were still fairly young. But they lived close enough to call to one another to come out to talk at their respective street corners. So Nick goes to the street corner while his mother receives a call from mine that Johnny was declared dead in the hospital. Idle brain aneurysm that was triggered by the fall. Nick's mom can hardly handle the news and is now wondering where her son went, but Nick comes back a few minutes later and says that he heard Johnny calling to him, but he wasn't at the street corner when he looked, then sits down to continue to eat his cereal. When his mom asks Nick what Johnny was saying, Nick says he had to come say goodbye. Number 7. Before my family and I moved to another state, my father went and visited the area to check on the progress of our new house, which was still being built. My father was there for a few days and was staying at some crappy Motel 6 in a shady area of town. His room was the last room at the end of the hallway on the top floor. In the middle of the night, on the last night he was in town, he was woken by the phone ringing in his room. He groggily answers. It was the front desk and they say something along the lines of, "Sorry to wake you, but we've been receiving a couple of reports about rooms being broken into and some stuff being stolen. We are calling to make sure you lock your doors and are safe." My father replies that he is fine and hangs up. He decides to go double check that he locked the door. As he sits up in bed, he notices that the door to his room is ajar. Being spooked, he continuously checks the room and finds out that nothing is missing and no one else is in the room. He creeps to the door and peeks out. Sitting right outside his room on the windowsill of the hallway window is his shaving kit. Creeped out of his mind, he quickly grabs it and locks the door. After he calms down a bit, he calls the front desk and says, "Hey, you just called me about the break-ins around the hotel, and I just wanted to report that my room was just broken into when I was sleeping. Nothing is stolen and I am fine. Figured you would like to know." The front desk replies, "You must have been mistaken. We never called your room and we haven't received any reports of break-ins." Number 6. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening. My son, 3 at the time, needed to go to bed at that point. I walked him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room that my mother-in-law passed away in was upstairs, and straight down the hallway as you reach the top of the landing. My son and I walked upstairs together, with me holding his hand. As we nearly reached the top of the stairs, my son stopped and wouldn't move, at the point which he could just see down the hallway. He was staring down the hall. I looked at him, then down the hall to an open doorway to a completely dark bedroom. He just stared and would not move any further. I asked him, "Buddy, are you okay?" His response was, "Daddy, the light. The light scares me." I looked again down the hallway where he was staring into darkness. "Buddy, you see a light?" "Yes, Daddy, it scares me." I promptly picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs stand on the back of my neck when I think about it. Number 5. A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it was this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this, and it stopped. Then after a week or so, it began again. The exact same noise, exact same time. Finally, one day he decided to backdial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about. Still, the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were left. He decided to say screw it, ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got a new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time, he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time, he lost his job and his phone. The call stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day, my mom asked me to listen to this weird message she got on her home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. Number 4. My grandfather told me this story about how one time he was sitting in a chair in front of the house when he heard his wife repeatedly calling him from inside the house. The thing is, my grandmother passed away a few years ago before that, but he told me the voice was so pressing that he actually got up to look inside the house. And as soon as he got inside, he heard a loud crash behind him and turned around to see that the chair he was sitting on moments ago had been crushed by a cast iron gutter that fell on it. If he didn't come inside the house, he probably would have been seriously injured. Number 3. Before I was born, my father and mother had a small apartment together. My mother told me once she went in the basement and saw a woman standing at the base of the steps just staring up at her, and then she just vanished. Then my father was in the shower, one with a sliding glass door that you can barely make out what's on the other side, when a large figure walked up to the other side of the glass and banged on it, making it blow out. My mother found him in the fetal position in the shower, covered in glass, and no one was around. The last one made them move out. He confirmed it happened but doesn't like to talk about it. He's a relatively tough dude, so for something to scare him that much means a lot. Somewhere in between those two occurrences, they came home to find absolutely everything moved over about an inch. They realized this because they're not very good at dusting. Number 2. Around the time I was 19, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with bombs, and honestly, I didn't know how I made it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was on a plane to the States. Now, my dad being ill was something I had grown used to. He was strong though, and I never expected to actually lose him. I lost my mother when I was 7, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere. Medication by the handfuls were needed every few hours. He gained weight from limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected to lose him and wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrive home, head to the hospital, and he assures me he's fine and they're overreacting. I visit him every day I'm there, but he tells me he'll be fine by the time I get home for good. I reluctantly go back overseas. I call the hospital whenever I have a few minutes of free time and we're near a call center. My deployment finishes and he kept his promise. He comes home from the hospital because he says he doesn't want to die there. He gets worse and goes back. The family all visits, but we know he isn't improving. One day, I'm at home and the phone rings. It's an unknown number, so I don't answer. It goes to the answering machine, and a very raspy voice mumbles, "Call the hospital." It's my dad. I grab the phone, but he had already hung up. So I call. They tell me he's been intubated, for the past couple hours, and he's starting to go into cardiac arrest. He's non-responsive, and we need to come to say our goodbyes. I argue that he just called me, and she says that's not possible. They've been working on him for some time now. I hung up and told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine. We played the tape again and again. This was the last time I heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the paranormal or ghosts, and I cannot come up with any logical explanation. I still get watery-eyed thinking about it. Number 1. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mountain of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late, he ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling comes back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see what the soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he just hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body and for some reason just to turn around and walk away. Got an idea for a top 15 list? Be sure to leave it in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching.